Well, it's late afternoon, a bit cool as you can see. Well, you can't see, can you? I'll be looking at why successive federal budgets haven't been able to tackle the problem of growing inequality in this country. Look, a budget's a very simple concept. Money in, money out. It's that simple. Now, over the last 40 to 50 years, we've seen a profound shift, not just in the economic relations between people in this country, but a profound shift in attitude. And as a people, that includes you and me, no exceptions, we have allowed these changes to occur, believing that if these changes were implemented, they would improve people's lives. On every available indicator, we have seen the rich and powerful grow richer and more powerful, and those on social security benefits and a significant proportion of wage earners move backwards dramatically. And this has occurred because we have embraced with both arms the neoliberal agenda of privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation and deregulation, believing the propaganda, and that's all it is, propaganda, by giving power and resources back to the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and having government move out of the way of the corporate sector, that somehow everybody's lives would improve. Now, obviously, in the 21st century we have access to more gadgets, just like this YouTube presentation you're looking at. But the dilemma is, access to more gadgets has meant a greater level of investment with the private investment for private profit sections of our community. We have now reached the situation where almost every essential service is now in private hands, from early childhood development to aged care. We have now seen a situation where it's illegal to withdraw your labour outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period in this country. So legislation has been passed over a number of decades which prevents people from coming together to improve their situation. At the same time, we've seen legislation which have seen assets which were publicly owned, which cross-subsidise services to everybody in the community, now being privately owned. And we've now got to the situation where you can buy the best education money can buy, you can buy the best healthcare money can buy. And that's a tragedy, because we are seeing an increasing number of Australians who cannot even access the basic necessities. Not just the 1/3 of Australians who are on social security benefits, like old age pensions, disability support pensions, unemployment benefits, single parents benefits. But what we saw during the robo-debt fiasco was government policy which was structured to demonise and marginalise people on social security benefits. And everybody thought at that particular point in time that it was these people who were the drain on the community. This is where the concept of the leaners and lifters comes from. But the reality is that what we've seen over the last 40 to 50 years is the growth of corporate welfare. What is corporate welfare? Why is it such a burden around people's necks? Why can't the government of the day, in a budget, put forward legislation to resolve this issue of growing inequality in a society as rich as Australia? 26.5 million people living on a continent which is resource rich. It shouldn't be very hard to ensure that everybody has access to the resources. So what is corporate welfare? Corporate welfare is when taxpayers' money, public money, your money, is used to support and expand private business. We see it in the aged care sector. It's got to such a degree the government is actually paying the increase, that's you and me, the increased wages of aged care workers because their wages are so low. We see it in the early childhood development sector where a wage rise which will occur will be paid for by the taxpayer. Now anybody can make a profit if the taxpayer gives them the money to run a business. See, so what privatisation did is it did three things. It removed profitable publicly owned services from the public sector, which meant that they could no longer give profits to Treasury. It removed competition in a monopoly-driven economy. We see it in real estate, housing, where we now have the ridiculous situation that wage earners, not just social security beneficiaries, can no longer or have a great deal of trouble finding the necessary resources to keep a roof over their head. We've seen it in education, where instead of funding universities, what we've done is we've introduced a HECS debt. So that once people graduate, they are burdened with a debt which in some cases takes a lifetime to pay, which means they can't access a mortgage for housing in a significant number of cases. So that's two. The third thing that privatisation does is it increases prices because it decreases competition. That's right, increases prices. We were told that the public sector is always inefficient. There's always cost blowouts. That you always need taxpayers' monies to subsidise the public sector. The reality is, the public sector, when the people owned essential services, aircrafts, that's Qantas, airports, telecommunications, shipping, ports, and the list goes on and on. What the public ownership meant is that everybody in the community had access to those services on the basis of need, not on the basis of how much cash you have in the bank, or how many investments you have, or how many shares you have. It's based on need. The other thing about the public sector is we have seen wholesale underfunding of the public sector. Nothing highlights this more than the privatisation of public housing, which is occurring at a rate of knots in this country. While governments fall over themselves to provide money to the private sector, to provide housing, money for public housing has disappeared. And those sections of the public housing which continue to exist are being rapidly privatised. So we see this in all spheres of human existence. We see the privatisation of essential services. So why does the government of the day never have enough resources? Well, there's a variety of reasons, but the main reason is that although Parliament is elected by the people, the type of people that are the parties that are elected time and time and time again are parties which support the status quo. We have a media that is almost totally owned, this is a legacy media, by a handful of people. And social media has become a swamp of disinformation and misinformation. Let's not forget that social media platforms are again owned by a handful of people who will do anything to draw eyeballs to their particular platforms so they can ask more money for advertising. So we have this constant misinformation and disinformation as part of our legacy. Deregulation. What's deregulation? It's very simple. It means removing regulation so that the government gets out of the way of business, so that business can increase its profits at the expense of everyone. So it's a difficult situation. So why? Well, legislation which is passed through Parliament basically maintains the status quo and increases the amount of taxpayers' revenue which goes to support the private sector. Instead of moving back to the state, taking care of the needs of its citizens and permanent residents, the state has reverted back to its original function, and that is a function of control. And when you look at the major political parties in this country, it's all about maintaining the status quo. So when the budget comes round every year, the government has a dilemma. The first dilemma is it does not have a legislative agenda which ensures the corporate sector pays a significant proportion of the taxation revenue. Although company profits have soared during COVID and during this inflationary crisis, company profits have soared, the cost has been borne by people in social security business and your average taxpayer. And even these new changes to the taxation laws will not have any impact on a corporate sector which basically pays voluntary taxation. When I say voluntary taxation, what I'm talking about is the fact that they pay legally minuscule taxation because of government-friendly legislation like negative gearing, which allows companies to legally minimise their tax while the burden falls on small business. And the tragedy is that most small and micro business somehow think they're different from a wage earner. The reality is that in a country where monopolies control every facet of our existence, it's almost impossible for small business to make a decent living. So getting back to the government. So the government has limited revenue. Limited revenue. Because most of the revenue which comes into the government coffers at a federal level comes from wage earners. Tax on wage earners. Although we have extraordinary amount of minerals and natural resources in this country, successive governments over generations have given over these resources for a peppercorn rent to transnational and national corporations whose major responsibility is to increase profits for their major shareholders. That's what a corporation is about. No such thing as a social corporate conscience or morality or ethics. Anybody who's been involved in any dispute with a corporation understands how it functions. So we have this tragedy where instead of the riches that are extracted from our natural resources going to the Treasury, and the Treasury having enough income to overcome the fact that 1 million children are living poverty in this country from a population of 26.5 million, that the bottom third of the population own 1% of this country's resources, well, the top 1% own over 70% of this country's resources. So the reality is, if you don't have a mechanism by which to curb corporations in terms of the power they exercise on the marketplace, the power they exercise socially, the power they exercise culturally, and the power they exercise on the political processes, you'll get the usual budget handout, like a $300 electricity, bonus. Scratches the surface, does little else. But it does little else because the means of communication are dominated by interests which want to continue to maximise their profits at the expense of everybody else. Not only the means of communication, but our economic networks. There is no competition in Australian society. Competition occurs, especially in a monopoly-based economy, when there is a strong public sector. For example, instead of wasting money on corporate welfare for housing, why not use that money to create increases in public housing? You increase public housing, you increase personal security, you have fixed rents, you have lifetime security. But no, we've created a whole new industry. Community housing, affordable housing, social housing, all privately owned. And we're all now encouraging the private sector to get involved in that area. As we saw with aged care, as we saw with early childhood development, as we saw during COVID with the lack of a pharmaceutical industry in this country, and the list goes on and on. So no wonder budgets come and go. By the time you watch this presentation, most people would have forgotten what was in the federal budget. The fact is, budgets come and go because they have minimal impact on the people that need the most resources. To allow corporations to dominate the economic sector without having a strong public sector and without creating a third tier of the economy based on collectives and cooperatives, we will continue to have budgets that scratch the surface, which cannot and will not resolve the growing inequality in this country, which is directly related to the strangulation of the economy by a shrinking number of duopolies and monopolies. So if you watch this presentation, I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests. We've now revamped the organisation. We will have a much more public focus during the next year. So you can complain, nobody will listen. You can jump up and down. They'll throw you out, saying, show us a bit of respect. obviously you're not getting any respect, or you can join like-minded people. Public interest before corporate interest. Go to the webpage, pibci.net. You can join online now. Thank you.